You must price your agreement for profitability. How do you know if your agreement is profitable? How do you fix it if it's not? We're covering those two questions on today's ramble because it's really important. So let's get started. I talk to a lot of MSPs in my travels, and a number of them that I talk to have set their pricing at what they think they can charge, right? They make up a number that seems reasonable, and then they go with it. For example, I was working with an MSP that was charging $99 a user. And they just set $99 a user at one point and just kind of went with it. The problem was that $99 a user included everything that they covered, right? It included all of their AV and their EDR and all these other pieces. And ultimately, when we looked at their P&L, they were actually not anywhere near as profitable as they thought they should have been based on what that looked like. And they just had a hard time kind of moving that needle to move that $99 up because they just could never get around to figuring out how to sell the value of their agreements to the clients. The problem is that $99 for that agreement, they didn't think about all of the different pieces that went into it, right? Because this MSP averaged about one ticket per month per device that they supported, right? That one ticket per month also averaged about 0.75 hours of support time. So you take that against a $150 an hour pricing, that's $112.50. 99 is a whole lot less than $112.50. So on a good day, they weren't ever able to hit the margins on that agreement side of the world. So that's what we're going to talk about today. That's why all of this agreement profitability stuff is so important. So you might be asking, how do you figure out the pricing of this agreement? And for me, it all starts with understanding your cost of goods sold, or your COG. If you don't know what COGs are, I'll link up above to a video about finance. But the idea here is you need to understand what it costs you to support an endpoint, right? And I'm going to use endpoint pricing. You can obviously add different site pricing. You could add different all kinds of other pricing. But I'm going to talk about the endpoints and users and those kinds of things because that is where, by and large, most of you have the most COGs that get related to it, and also where the most quantities of things lands. You need to understand your COGs. And really, for any managed services client, there's a couple different types of COGs that you're going to care about, right? The one is going to be your cloud or your stack COGs, and the second one's going to be your service. So let's start with cloud and stack, and we'll move on to service in a minute. The first thing you need to do is to understand what it costs you to deliver the EDR and the spam filtering and the RMM and all the different pieces that it takes you to support that client on a per device basis, on a cost, on a per line item basis, and then you can simply mark it up. Now, I recommend that you mark it up 100%, which basically means that you're giving yourself a 50% gross margin on it, and simply you just take whatever the cost is and you multiply it by 2. It's as easy as that. Now, that said, you might want to adjust it up or down a little bit depending on what's going on. So you can feel free to adjust it as you need to, but you want to make sure that you're building margin in to this side of the agreement. Now, the easier part of all of this is that cloud side of the world, right? You just take your COGS, you double them, and you're good enough, right? Or at least close. So now let's talk about the service side, because that's just a little bit trickier. You need some information from your PSA in order to calculate this accurately. So let's talk about what that looks like, and then we'll talk about what to do if you don't have it here in a second. You're going to need some information, things like service ticket time entries. You're going to need information like what your NOC team spends on stuff. You're going to need information about your account manager, whoever does account management for your company and spends time with your clients. Those 3 buckets of time are pretty important to grab. And what you'll want to do is you want to output some version of a time spent report based on those 3 different types of information. And that is a pretty good start. You take the output of data and you divide it by number of months in that report, and then divide that by number of endpoints, and that gets you a pretty solid time per endpoint calculation. That number is probably somewhere between a half hour and an hour and a half, and know that that number might change over time. So then the question is, what do you do if you don't happen to have that information? Maybe you're not tracking time or that kind of thing. And I think it's pretty safe to get a sense of how much time you're spending on clients. It's going to be a very much thumb in the wind kind of a feeling. But as long as you're in that half hour to an hour and a half, you're probably pretty close. I might err on the heavier side just in case. It's better to have some wiggle room versus undercharging and having to come back and increase rates by a significant margin in the future. It's also probably a good time for you to start tracking time. I think that's an important thing to understand for your overall profitability, but also your client profitability. So tracking time is important. In either case, you now have a number that signifies what the service side of the world should be from a time spent piece. So now you take that time per endpoint per month, multiply it by your hourly rate, and you're going to get some number, right? That number is probably what you should be charging for the service side per month per endpoint. Let's put those things together. We're going to take the cloud and stack component, and you want to add it together with the service component, right? You take those two selling numbers together and you're going to get some number. Now here's where I like to add a little bit of a fudge factor. I might round it up to the nearest number that makes sense, right? So if you come back with $143, you maybe round it up to 150. If you come back with 162, you might round it up to 175, right? It doesn't really matter a ton, but know that you should round it up a little bit, give yourself a little bit more wiggle room. You can always reduce it in the future or give your client a credit or something if you really feel like it later. Now you have this number, it becomes incumbent on you as the business owner to sell the value of your company. And your value is not that you answer the phone faster or that your texts are smarter or that your stack is super awesome. I'm sure all three things are true, but that is not the value you bring to your client. The value you bring is decreasing their risk, increasing their profitability, helping them grow their business, helping them be more productive. Those kinds of things are where your value lies, and you need to be able to speak to that. If you can't speak to that, that might be an area that you work on, because if you treat yourself like a commodity and expect to be treated like a commodity, they're going to treat you like a commodity, and that's a race to the bottom, and you don't want that. It's really hard to compete on price. It's far better to compete on the value that you bring to your clients. So make sure you're pricing your offering smartly and make sure you're building margin into both sides of that agreement, and I think things will go in the right direction for you. So with all of that, I want to thank you for being on this ramble with me today. Please click that like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in a future one.